The Paternal Metaphor I, Part 2 of 4. So, here are two terms, two poles that we have defined in relation to this evolution of interest around the Oedipus complex. Firstly, that which concerns, as we have said, the question of the superego and of neuroses without the Oedipus complex. And then that which centres the question of the Oedipus complex on its acquisition, or more exactly, on perturbations produced in the field of reality. A third term that deserves as much attention and that is going to give us our next heading is the way the Oedipus complex relates to something that is not the same thing, to generalization as it is referred to. The Oedipus complex, let's not forget, in the midst of so many explorations, questions, discussions, this is something that has almost passed into the background of the story, but always remains implicit in all clinical approaches. The Oedipus complex has a normative function, not only in the moral structure of the subject and in his relationships, but in the process of taking on his sex, i.e. something that in psychoanalysis, as you know, always retains a certain ambiguity. There is the correctly speaking genital function, and this function is very clearly the object of a maturation as such. It is involved as a fundamental aspect in the analysis of a first phase, a first advancement towards maturation that, with this, is correctly speaking organic and happens in childhood. The question of the link between this first sexual surge, with which, as you know, an organic, anatomical basis is sought in, for example, the double surge that is produced at the level of the testicles and the formation of spermatozoon. The question of the relation between this and the existence in the human species of the Oedipus complex has remained a phylogenetic question over which much obscurity hovers, to the point that no one will dare write articles on the subject anymore. But at the end of the day, this subject has nonetheless had its place in the history of psychoanalysis. Hence, the question of genitalization is a double one. It is, on the one hand, something that consists in an evolution, a maturation. And on the other hand, in the Oedipus complex, it consists of something that is realized. That is the taking on by the subject of their own sex. Let's name it the fact that the man takes on a virile type and that the woman takes on a certain feminine type, recognizes herself as a woman, identifies with her role as a woman. Virility and feminization, here are the two terms that are essentially the function of the Oedipus complex. I have to say that we find ourselves here at the level where Oedipus is directly linked to the function of the ego ideal. There is no other way of looking at it. Here then are the three headings in which you can classify everything that has been produced in the way of discussion about the Oedipus complex, and at the same time about the father's function, for they are one and the same thing. There is no question of that. If there were no father, there would be no Oedipus complex, and vice versa. To speak of Oedipus is to insert the function of the father as essential. Hence, for those who are taking notes, on the subject of the historical evolution of the Oedipus complex, everything revolves around three headings. In relation to the superego, in relation to reality, in relation to the ego ideal. The ego ideal always bringing genitalization with it, insofar as it has been taken on, has become an element of the ego ideal. Reality as a heading implies the relations between the Oedipus complex and the afflictions that make up a dislocation of the relationship with reality, i.e. perversion and psychosis. Now, let's try to go a bit further. It is clear that here, under the third heading, i.e. on the question of the Oedipal function, insofar as it directly reverberates with this process of assuming a gender, something that has not been elucidated much within the whole question of the castration complex, it is here that we are going to advance. So, anyway, given these overall global relations, underlined by the history that is available to everyone, we are going to ask, well then, what about the father? What is he, the father, doing during this period? In what way does the father get involved in the thing? It is a question of real observation in relation to each subject. The question of the absence or the presence of the father, of the beneficial or sinister quality of the father is, as you know, a question that is certainly not hidden. We have even seen the term paternal deficiency appear recently, which is not a slight subject to tackle. The question of knowing what it has been possible to say on this subject, and whether that stands up, is another question. But in the end, this paternal deficiency, whether one calls it this or not, is in some way a subject that is on the agenda these days. Precisely and especially within an evolution of psychoanalysis that becomes more and more environmentalist, as is said in the same vein. I.e., it is about what? Naturally, not all analysts fall into this error, thank God. Many analysts to whom you may report important biographical information in order to say to them, but the parents didn't get on, there was conjugal discord, this explains everything, will respond to you, even those we are not always in agreement with, will say to you, so what? That proves absolutely nothing. We cannot expect any specific kind of result. And in this they would be right. That said, when we look, what are we interested in relation to the father? When we want to speak of paternal deficiency, this gets grouped in some way in a biographical register. Was the father there or not? Did he travel? Was he away? Did he come back often? Questions that represent the absence of the father. Can an Oedipus complex be constituted in a normal way when there isn't a father, for example? These are definitely questions that are very interesting in themselves. And I would go further. It is from here that, in fact, the first paradoxes get introduced. The ones that have then posed the questions that have followed. It was perceived that it is not as simple as that. That an Oedipus complex could very well be constituted even when the father is not there. Even at the beginning, it was always believed that it was through some excess, if we can put it like that, presence through excess of the father, that all the dramas had been generated. At the time when the terrifying father had been considered to be the injuring element. In neurosis, it was quickly realized that it was even more serious when he was too nice. These lessons were learnt slowly. And it is initially from the interior of this that I speak to you in a roundabout way of the question of where things are now. And it is from the interior of this that I am going to try to put things back into some order in order to see where the paradoxes are. We are now at the other extreme, in asking ourselves about paternal deficiencies. There are what are called weak fathers, submissive fathers, checkmated fathers, fathers castrated by their wives, in the end disabled fathers, blind fathers, deformed fathers, whatever you want. All the same, we must try to realize what comes out of such a situation. We must try to find the minimal formulae that allow us to progress. To begin with, the question of his presence or absence, concrete I mean. If we put ourselves at the level where these research studies are at, i.e. at the level of reality, this is what is called the environment, as an environmental element, if you will. One can say that it is totally possible, conceivable, realizable, an element of experience that it is there, even when it is not there. Something which should already prompt us to a certain prudence in relation to the father function, in the handling of it from the purely and simply environmentalist point of view. Completely normal Oedipus complexes, normal in the sense, normal insofar as normalizing on the one hand, and also normal insofar as they denormalize, I mean by their neurotic effect, for example, take hold in a way that is exactly homogeneous to the other cases, even in the cases where the father is not there. I mean when the child has been left on its own with the mother. This is the first thing that must attract our attention. As far as the deficiency is concerned, I would simply like you to take note that when the father is deficient, to the extent that deficiency is spoken of, it is never known in what way, because if in certain cases it is said that he is too nice, that seems to mean that he has to be nasty. On the other hand, the fact that manifestly he can be too nasty implies that he should perhaps be nice now and then. In the end, this little merry-go-round has been going on for a long time. The problem of his deficiency has been glimpsed not in a direct way concerning the subject directly, the child that it is about, but, as was evident since the beginning, it is as a member of the fundamental family trio, ternary of the family, meaning that it is through taking up his place in the family that things can begin to be said that are a bit more efficacious concerning the deficiency. But nonetheless, we have not yet managed to formulate them better. I don't want to go on about this too much, but we already spoke about it last year in relation to little Hans. We saw the difficulties that we are having, looking at it solely from the environmentalist point of view, to specify what this deficiency consists of in a personality who is far from being deficient. We are going to be able to go a bit further in this sense, that the personality was altogether far from being deficient in his family. He was there, close to his wife. He played his role, he discussed things. To some extent he gets the brush off from his wife, but in the end he looks after the child a lot. He was not absent, and so little absent that he even analyzes his child. That's the best perspective that we can get on the father, in this sense here at least. I think that this question of the father's deficiency, we are going to come to it, we will come back to it, but we are entering here into a world that is so shifting that it is necessary to try to make a distinction that will allow us to see where the research falls down. The research falls down not because of what it finds, but because of what it seeks. I think that the fault in direction is this. It's that two things get conflated that are related to each other but should not be conflated. It's the relationship between the father as normative and the father as normal. Of course, the father can be denormalizing insofar as he is himself not normal, but this would be to reject the question at the level of the neurotic, psychotic structure of the father. Hence, the question of the normal father is one question. The question about his normal position in the family is another one. And this other question should also not be conflated. This is the third point that I put to you that is important, should not be conflated with an exact definition of his normalizing role. Because I tell you this, to speak of his deficiency in the family is not to speak of his deficiency in the complex. Because to speak of his deficiency in the complex, another dimension must be brought in besides the realist dimension, if I may say so, the one that is defined by the characterological, biological, or other mode of his presence in the family. Here is the direction in which we are going to take the next step. Let's come now to the remarks, the reminders that can allow us to bring in more correctly the question of the role of the father. If it is his place in the complex in which we can find the direction to advance in, the direction that will allow us to make a correct formulation, let's now question the complex and start by going back to the beginning, to the ABC. At the beginning, as I have told you, the father is terrifying. All the same, the image epitomizes something much more complex, as the name indicates. The father intervenes on several levels. He forbids access to the mother to start with. That is the foundation, the principle of the Oedipus complex. It's here that the father is linked to the primordial law, the law forbidding incest. It's the father, we are reminded, who is charged with representing this prohibition. Sometimes he has to demonstrate it in a direct way. If the child lets loose with his explorations, his expressions, his tendencies. But it is far beyond this that he exerts his role. It's through his whole presence, through his effects on the unconscious, that he exerts this prohibition of the mother. You expect me to say, under threat of castration. It's true, it has to be said, but it is not as simple as that. To be sure, castration takes on an evidently manifest role, and one that will be confirmed more and more elsewhere. The link between castration and the law is essential. But let's look at how we encounter this in clinical presentations. How, to begin with, the Oedipus complex presents itself to us. I am obliged to remind you of it because that must evoke in you all sorts of things that are evocative, textually.